Welcome to the 17th episode of Patio Ponderings podcast. Today we tackle the tough topic of farm transition with my guest Ted Hamer from Traer, Iowa. Sit back and enjoy a cup of coffee as Ted and I reminisce about his farming career, the decision to transition his farm to his son Caleb and his partner Scott, and along the way we'll gain some nuggets of wisdom from Ted's experience as a farmer over more than 40 years. My guest is a friend of mine, Ted Hamer from Traer, Iowa. Ted started farming on his own in the early 80s in the midst of all the challenges of the farm crisis. And what we want to talk about with Ted is how he transitioned his daily operation of his farm to his son and one of his son's partners in B&H Ag Services about 6 years ago. And we want to talk about Ted's approach to transition and what inspired the transition, and maybe give us some insights on how others that are in the midst of planning for a transition might pick some nuggets for him. And along the way, Ted and I are going to talk. I've had the great fortune of breaking bread and praying at Ted's house, and we might have enjoyed a snort or two of some good bourbon. So welcome today, Ted.
Well, thanks for having me, Jim. I feel honored to be on your podcast.
Well, Ted, before we get started and dive into the topic, could you just kind of give us an overview of the highlights of your background, the evolution of your farm, and a little bit about your family?
I was born. That was probably the highlight. And then, I grew up. I'm the fifth of six children. My dad was very close to becoming a career Navy man, and my maternal grandfather called him and asked if he wanted to come take over the farm. And so my dad started farming when he was about 38 years old. Learned how to farm from his father-in-law, which has a lot of jewels in his crown in heaven. I'm quite convinced of that. And so my older siblings, my oldest brother was about 16 when they moved to the farm in 1953, 54. I was born in 61, so I've been on the farm my entire life. In fact, and a little bit of what you talked about earlier, Jim, about where we might want to go with this is I'm living on the same building site I grew up on. I moved away 1 mile for about 6 years, and then came back to here and been here ever since. But so my dad was 44 years older than me. When I turned 22, Dad was 66, and I started farming. And to be honest, I think part of my transition story is that I took what I knew, and what I knew was my dad pretty much got out of my way. I don't know if it was taking orders or thinking he never had a chance to really call the shots himself with my father-in-law so closely involved. But basically, he let me have the reins from day one. And I've always said this, and anybody that's talked to me before, my dad kicked my butt when it needed to be. That's no doubt about it. But he really did let me call my own shots. And I think that's part of my transition story to Scott and to Caleb. And I think leadership and how you do this plays a big part in that story. But yeah, so I've been farming. Yes, I started in 1983 was my very first crop, and had a drought in 83, had a drought in 88, had a drought in 89. And then plus all the farm crisis going on at that time. But to be honest, it probably wasn't a horrible time to start, because I didn't come in with a boatload of debt, except buying my parents out of farm equipment.
And that farm equipment that you bought was a pittance compared to today.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I remember, I think we signed a 15-year note, and I thought, I'll never pay this off. I'll never pay this off. Boy, those years go by pretty fast. And I don't think, if I remember right, I'd have to go back and look. I don't think it was $100,000. I don't think it was that much. And it's like, wow. And I did buy the cattle from them. We had cattle at that time. And I was already into hogs on my own. I had started raising, I had sows when probably when I turned about 19 or 20. I had my own sow herd going. But
So you were a typical
yeah, just
Iowan.
like crazy. Yeah, yeah. And I went to the banker and I wanted to double the size of the cattle herd. And, I wasn't really thinking too clearly. And he said, you can't put cattle out on this prime farm ground. He said, I'd rather go to the hog house with you. And I said, well, if I can't expand the herd, I'm getting rid of all of them. And so I did,
Mm-hmm.
and went out and bought the first cab tractor on this farm,
Oh, cool.
a Ford TW20, and I ran the wheels off of that tractor, and I think I put one clutch and one alternator in that tractor, and I think it had, I don't remember, 8,000 hours when I got
Oh,
rid of it.
my.
Yeah, it was a wonderful tractor and fuel efficient. My goodness.
Wow. Knowing how much red you have on the farm, it's surprising to hear you started with blue.
Oh yeah, yeah, and then actually went from Ford kind of to Massey, a little bit of Massey, and then Case IH. And that's a whole different story, but there was a big falling out over the largest combine dealership, which was about 25 miles from me.
That's the one up at Dyke?
The Case I, yeah, the one at Dyke went totally under, and then some greens started showing up on the farm. So
Okay.
now it's about half and half,
All right.
green and red.
One of the things that you brought up as you're discussing your transition is an experience that I shared on one of my podcasts earlier. And I shared a lot anonymously that I was at a feed mill picking up some feed. An acquaintance of mine was there getting feed with his dad. And at the time, this man was my age, so mid-50s. And his dad was just hounding him. Georgie, did you get this? Georgie, did you do that? Georgie, did you get this feed? And the 55-year-old man he kind of looked like Eeyore. He was doing all the work. And I bet he had not run corn planter yet. And he was my age and grew up on the farm.
Yep.
So that's a lot different than the experience you had with your dad.
Yes. Yeah, I did. And I think Dad knew I had the aptitude I needed to do it. I rode with him all the time. I was beside him all the time. I wanted to be. And to be honest, at 44, now that I look back at it, maybe he was more like a grandpa than a dad. I don't mean that disrespectfully to him, but I just mean that I think he was a lot calmer, probably with me being the fifth child, and I never threw anything at him that he didn't already know, and so I think that plays into it. And I think just the fact that he's 44 years older, and I've noticed in my life, once you kind of get through your mid 40s and stuff like that, you're, at least for me, I felt more secure in who I was, and I relax a little bit. But when you're pushing and striving and running hell bent for election in your 20s and 30s and stuff, that may not be the greatest time to like train somebody because you don't know yourself.
Well, I think about my children. We've got 10 years between the oldest and the youngest, and I think about how I interact with my youngest now. It's quite a bit different than my two oldest ones. So yeah, I get to see where that would
absolutely.
Yeah. So what?
Yeah, and so Dad was just relaxed around me.
So he's more of like a mentor than a parent. Would you say that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like I said, kick my butt when it needed it, but yeah, he still played the role of dad when he needed.
Okay. So what was it in your life, or what experience was it that prompted you to stay on the farm instead of, say, going to work at John Deere in Waterloo?
Oh, I would say that and here again, I think the age difference played a big role. I knew Dad, a lot of guys, working with their parents, and they're only 22, 23 years apart. My older siblings, I think, would have liked to have farmed, but they just knew at that stage they wouldn't, so they chose different occupations. And for me, the timing was just absolutely perfect. That Dad was about ready to retire when I took over.
I bet if you would have been 3 or 4 years older, your experience would have been different from the farm crisis. You wouldn't have stepped into something that was not a lucrative situation, but it wasn't bad.
Right. Right. Yes. Correct. Correct. And I think mom and dad getting out at the time they did, uh, just before and things weren't all that great in 82, 83 already. I mean, 79 kind of was the peak, and I remember some farm ground selling for $4,000 an acre, and I went, how in the world are they ever going to pay
Yeah,
for that?
and they didn't.
But, and they didn't. A lot of them didn't. I've got a neighbor down the road that's still farming, and Dick's probably 25 years or 15 years older than I am. And I remember Dick's saying he was laying in bed, and morning radio had kicked on, and they were talking about interest rates. And he said, I knew how much money I had borrowed, and they had just ticked up to like 19%. And he said, it's costing me, and I don't remember the number, but he said, it's costing me X amount of dollars a day, whether I get out of bed or not. And it was
Oh
like,
boy.
yeah. But long story short, Dick's done wonderfully well for himself. So, but all the things that we think of, I mean, there's not one of us that hasn't put that figure through your head. In fact, I just the other day just made another loan payment on some farm ground we're buying, and the next day I always go online to see how much that changed my daily interest
There you
rate
go.
or daily per diem.
Yeah. Yep. Oh yeah, we do that too. You make that mortgage payment.
Yes.
Go, hey, there we go. We owned another $15.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
What was it that after 35 years of farming or so that you decided, hey, my son Caleb is ready to take over?
I would say probably three things. Change was the pushed me to get something done. First of all, we had just joined a farming peer group, and a company out of Harlan, Iowa, HTS Ag, it was starting farming peer groups, and we got into a peer group, and we were meeting 4 times a year, and a lot of that was early 2017. And a lot of that was about legacy, personal planning, financials, all that type of stuff. How do you transition? A lot of emphasis on that. So it got me thinking. Also, I was in the process of splitting with a farming operation I had partnered with over the years. And my son Caleb and Scott Minkin were working for both of us. They were our employees, and then once we split, um, Caleb and Scott would work for whichever operation needed them the most that day.
Mm-hmm.
And so they would kind of bill us back and forth, and that was pretty decent. But at some point, and that's a little further down the story, but I just thought, if I don't get them involved, I'm going to lose them.
Mm-hmm.
I needed to get them to have skin in the game.
Okay.
Or I thought, and to be honest, you're talking about guys in their late 20s, early 30s, and they basically aren't calling any shots. And here I am. I've been calling the shots since I was 22 years old. And I thought, yeah, I could understand why they would like to have some input. And third of all, and you know this well, Jim, I was diagnosed with stage 4 melanoma in June of 2017. And to be honest, right off the bat, it didn't look very good. A couple of doctors that I talked to, and they weren't oncologists, and I shouldn't have got quite as upset as I did. But, talking about maybe I had 2 years.
So you had the mortality bent to it also.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it did. Yes. Hey, maybe I'm not going to be here, in a couple of years, and we need to get this done. So, as it turned out, thankfully, in about 6 months, I'm going to be 5 years cancer free, and there's no hint of it. And they never use the words remission with me, so thankful for that, and praising God for that, obviously. But so all three of those events happening pretty much all at the same time was a big factor in moving forward. And I also felt that if we were going to expand, it probably was going to come from Caleb and Scott.
Mm-hmm.
And not that I have a bad personality. I think I've got landlords that really enjoy my company, but they also do. And I think they've got great people skills. And I could see that if they didn't have an incentive, why would they use their people skills to get larger if there's nothing in it for them?
Well, why get larger just for you?
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So, and they had a little bit of a farming. They were renting one farm, 160 acres, just that they had with one landlord. But yeah, it was. And to be honest, I would say going back to hearing one peer group speaker that we had brought in, man's name is Steve Bohr, and Steve has a business called Farm Financial Strategies Incorporated. Steve's his office is in Lisbon. Steve actually lives in Washington, Iowa. But and Steve writes a lot for the Iowa Farming Today newspaper. And I remember sitting listening to him for 2 hours in a peer group setting, and I went, "Oh my gosh, this guy is good, and he knows how to do this, and we need to get with him." And because of that peer group meeting, I think I had an appointment with Steve before he left the room.
Wow.
And Steve walked us through how to transition. You know, what was I looking for? What are Scott and Caleb looking for? What's my wife looking for? He did, you know, he has an uncanny knack of almost not even getting it out of your mouth, and he can tell what it is you most desire.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that's the biggest that Steve brings to the table is he can pull out of people in a very short period of time what's most important to them, what's most important to them about this transition. And so we, you know, my operating entity was a C corporation, and so there were several different ways we could transition that. One would be and I can't remember all the tax ramifications on all three of those. I'd have to go back and look at my notes, but I do know that one of the options was for Scott and Caleb just to buy my stock.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's great for me from a tax standpoint, but for them, buying stock in a corporation is not deductible. You can't depreciate it.
Okay.
So that would be, and then they would actually have ended up with a negative capital balance without being able to depreciate it. And I'm sure I'm getting that all mixed up a little bit, but in the end, we and 2019 was the look, you know, not knowing whether Trump was going to be reelected, but we had the C corporation capped at 21%. So I figured that maybe that might be the last time we see that low of a high bracket.
Mm-hmm.
So we went ahead and I sold out to them. You know, basically just the machinery. There was no land involved because the land there's no land in the C corporations. We met with all our landlords, told them what we were doing. They were all 100% on board with what we were doing, had no issues with it whatsoever. And so I took had a big tax bill at the end of 2019 because of this. And to be honest with you, just settled within the last month or two with the IRS on the final part of it. And then when COVID hit and nobody would answer the phone and nobody was in the office and they were just generating automatic computer generated letters kept coming, and it was like, I don't owe this. And but you couldn't talk to anybody because nobody was in the office. But anyway, that's a long story short that I finally have the IRS paid off now. But and I gave the boys a discount. To to be honest, like, and Steve Moore walked us through all that. You could call it a quantity discount. They were the ones buying all of it at once. I didn't have to get an auctioneer in. I didn't have to pay them 7% or whatever to hold an auction and all this stuff. So I think it was fair and equitable. Could I probably have done better with a farm sale? Probably. But then what was I going to do? And so the way we set it up is we are an S corporation now. Caleb owns 40%. Scott owns 40%, and I still own 20%. And they still cut me a paycheck.
Okay. There you go. So you are truly working for your son.
Yes.
Okay. You said a couple things in there that strike me. Thinking about the past 45 years, or no, 41 years since you started farming. Think about the transition from a pure monetary magnitude. So if you took over from your parents, you said you had $100,000 loan, okay? Ish.
Yeah, if it was that.
Yeah. So less, $100,000 or less. I'm sure your tax bill to IRS was a lot closer
higher than that.
Yeah. And the equity position and the liability position that Caleb now has of taking over the S Corp is magnitudes more than what you were talking about with your dad 40 years ago.
Oh, my goodness, yes. I mean, I think there's a lot of farmers talking about this, but, if you look at our line item to produce the crop, the number one, the fastest growing is the machinery line. It just keeps escalating and escalating. And to be honest, that's why they keep, bigger equipment, faster equipment. I mean, to be honest, what we're doing today, and I told you just before we started doing the podcast, Jim, that I'd fallen off the back of the corn planter out in the shop. We're putting high speed on the planter, and that all that technology and all that. But getting back to your thought about, I mean, just watching the amount of capital you have tied up in equipment is insane, and that's why you look for more acres to drive that across to get, call it contribution margin or whatever you have. You have the machinery anyway, and we look at that very hard. How many more acres can we take on without having to make a significant change in equipment? And, for a lot of times we're talking about, I think we could take another 400 acres on and not have to do anything different. Well, take that line of machinery and divide it by
104% or 105%.
Yes, yeah. Right.
And those are the same discussions
so that's what drives it.
And those are the same discussions that I had in the feed business when we were looking at bringing on a large customer. I remember one where we were just going to make gestation feed and lactation feed, simple feed, and we could run that overnight. So we would pick up incremental tons, reduce overhead costs, increase throughput without really making any change. The mixer just mixes up a truckload of feed, runs it to the pellet mill overnight, and boom, we get more. The pellet mill was already there. No different than you're talking about with the planter. We got the planter. What's another 400 acres? On our discussion starting back to 1983, and I don't remember where I had this conversation, but it sticks in my head that if you went belly up in 1980, in 1979, 80, 81, and you weren't stupid, I mean, didn't have a stupid amount of real estate debt, you could go work at John Deere, and over your lifetime, you could pay off that debt you had at the bank in Traer.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
If something bad happened today, Caleb could never pay off what he owes by going to town.
Yeah, it would be tough.
Yeah. So the story in there is that farming has changed because of the magnitude of the money that is involved. And that relates in to how the transition plans need to change also, because splitting a 40 between 6 and $100,000 for the equipment in 1983 was no big deal. Trying to break apart a multi-million-dollar, multi-hundred-acre operation like you have isn't just as simple as saying, well, we're just going to split it. Go enjoy what you're going to do.
In my case, it's not horrible because I only have one child.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I did my legacy planning right off the bat.
Boom. I know who gets it. I know who's number one in
Yeah,
line.
but I think that's what is so. And to be honest, I think the number one reason that people don't do it is they're scared. They don't. They don't know how to do it. They don't know. Maybe they don't even really know what they want, or they're scared what they really want is going to upset people, and they don't want to confront it now. They'd rather be gone in the grave and let them all fight for it. And for me, even though I only have one child, for me, the satisfaction of knowing I've transitioned it, and I hope I live another 25, 30 years, but to have that done and everything, and Jim, I know I've said this to you a lot, and probably now's the time to say it during this podcast is I would really like to get up in front of a bunch of older men and tell them how much fun they can have farming if they would get this done. I'm having a ball. I really am. Caleb and Scott are making all the decisions. Thankfully, they think enough of me to include me in on those decisions, but I can see it's happening more and more that they aren't necessarily coming to me for my advice on everything, and I am super cool with that. And to be honest, they've never asked for my opinion much on the agronomy side because as a farmer, that's my weakest area, and I'm more than willing to admit it. So when it comes to chemicals, fertilizer, they're way ahead of me, and so they don't even the salesmen come. I'm really not even included on those
I'm going to go get
conversations,
coffee,
and
see what Linda's doing.
I'm just fine with that. Yeah.
You were talking about your peer group, and you said you had 3 thoughts in your head, but the catalyst to put all those thoughts into motion was Steve, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
was that because those 3 thoughts and the transition was overwhelming because it was just what it was, a C corporation, lots of dollars? Or was it that you needed Steve to just kind of take your hand and say, we can have a plan, your thoughts are not out of whack?
To be honest, I don't think I knew. I don't think I knew how to do it.
Yeah.
And, listening to him and he walked in our peer group that day, he walked down several avenues of what happens and how it could happen and what it could look like. And it was like, oh, maybe this isn't as bad as I think,
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, so Scott and Caleb and I went to Steve's office and, bared our soul basically from a financial situation and everything like that and said, what's this look like? How do we move forward? And he said, well, Ted, how much control do you want to have? That's first because it's yours right now.
Well, at least they didn't say,
willing to.
Well, at least they didn't say, let's call national.
Exactly. So, but yeah, the thing is, and I've said that, and I truly mean it. Yeah, obviously, I constantly worried about our financial position, watching the numbers. But the thing is with Scott and Caleb, they both are so tremendously good at what they do. Scott is sensational in the shop with equipment. Mm-hmm. He's great at that. He watches our maintenance. And then Caleb's usually in the office with the marketing and the financials. And I tell them because my previous situation with former business partner is, I know that the one outside doing the work can sometimes get jealous of the one that's in the office thinking they aren't doing anything. And I think Caleb and Scott do a pretty good job of checking with each other every day about, what got accomplished, and Caleb kind of gives an accounting of what he's done during the day. Scott, and then they're talking back and forth well to, it's Scott saying, hey, we need to upgrade this. And Caleb's going, can we get another year out of it? Because we really can't afford to do that right now. And Scott says, yeah, but then we should do this, this, and this. I think they're handling it really, really well. And it's fun to watch them Yeah, do we get on each other's nerves from time to time? You can't work that closely with each other, not get on each other's nerves. But I think they do a really good job of talking things through and relying on each other. I think that's a huge point too, that they do really rely on each other. So,
W- Ted,
and it's obvious. Yeah.
Ted, would it be safe to say that your son is in two really good marriages?
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, I would say that.
As you're talking about how they work together, they're working together than most of our marriages. And I don't mean me and you, I just mean in general.
No, I get that. Yes. No, you're right. And yeah, it is, and it has to be. And I mentioned this the other day in a little roundtable I was in a discussion, um, that, and if you're going to form a partnership, there's a couple of different ways you can do it. You can kind of date, and that's where you each keep your own stuff and you just charge each other back and forth for the services, and that's a really good way to do
Hmm.
things. And then there's getting married, where basically what Scott and Caleb have done. It's all in one pot. It's all together, owned together. Now they each individually own some farm ground that's not in the S corp, and I don't ever suggest we do have any in it. But and so if you're married, then you got to be really committed.
Hmm.
But I think the worst one is being engaged, and that's where you kind of have yours and mine, and we started something together, and we're kind of living together, and to be honest, that was the part of my former partnership, that I think probably led to our separating, and it wasn't nothing really bad. It just that it became obvious that we're getting different business philosophies and things like that, and so a separation was necessary. But that's really hard to break up when you got yours, mine,
Hmm.
and ours.
Oh, yeah.
So I
Because,
would suggest just either dating or getting fully married,
I think that's sound
so you know
advice
which is which.
on and off the farm.
Yes.
Well, one of the things that strikes me is that you came from one of six and you had one, but you still had a complicated transition, even though you just had Caleb as the sole beneficiary, right?
Yeah, in this case, I mean, we aren't transitioning. I mean, Scott's not going to inherit any of my farm ground or
Hmm.
anything like that. So that's. But the operation itself, yeah, Caleb wasn't going to go forward. I thoroughly believe this. I They're both phenomenal men, but were they need each other. They really do.
So how did you
And
pick that?
so,
How did you pick those two, that partner for your son?
well, they were already in partnership together because they worked for us in my previous partnership, from about two. Well, Scott started working for my partner and me in 2006.
Hmm.
We asked Caleb to come back in 2008. So
Okay.
they had been with us for 8 years already before before we split, and then before I transitioned. So they'd been together for 12 years before we transitioned out of Hamer Farms into B&H Ag.
Okay. So they had a long engagement. They knew who each other were.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. They worked side by side, back when they would go out and make fun of my business partner and me because, we didn't. I know they did, and I know they still make fun of me, but that's okay.
Well, hey, I will tell you, I texted Caleb beforehand saying, "Hey, give me some juicy nuggets on your dad," and he just smiled. You have an interesting upbringing being one of six. How have you incorporated your siblings into the legacy that you have on farm or farm ground without including them in day-to-day operations?
Well, when my parents died, the farm ground, which isn't a lot, I think we own my parents. I had changed some ground back and forth with them, and then We bought my wife's family farm, and then my folks got out of 60 acres there. So they got some cash and they got some farm ground, and we started a family LLC to own the farm ground together. And then one of my brothers has bought out my two sisters. So the four boys are left with the farm ground that's basically uh, sits just north of me. And so I don't have to, the only ones I do have to answer to are my two of, my three older brothers. Um, and actually, I don't have to answer to them because their leases, farm leases with B&H Ag. So
Hey, it's not me. It's your nephew.
it's not me. It's not me. Yeah. You got a beef, talk to your nephew. Um, and the other thing I did is Linda and I were able to build a new home in 2011, and all my siblings had grown up in the farmhouse that I grew up in, and I kind of wanted them to feel um, welcomed
Hmm.
anytime they came back here. And I know you've seen it, Jim, but going down the stairs, I've got all the farm pictures from past years hanging on the wall, and above it, I say the house has changed, the house has changed, but the home still remains.
That's a good
So
point.
that I wanted them to feel welcome every time they come back in here.
Well, and that's an interesting way to put it because there are people that don't have your heart that would be, this is a fresh start. You guys no longer live here. The house is gone. It's my place.
Yeah, but to be honest, they've all respected it. I mean, I've never had any issues that way. They've all respected everything. And to be honest, I think all the things I did with mom and dad, we did document it. I mean, it wasn't, trying to put anything under the table, and if anybody asked, we could say, here's what we did. In fact, that 60 acres that mom and dad ended up selling, I traded them. I gave them 60 acres I had purchased for the 40 acres here with a building site.
Okay.
So we did that and had it all documented that it was fair and equal.
Look at these large families, and particularly being an Amish community, we see large families. And you look at the
Yeah.
firstborn that's 20 years older to the lastborn that's 40 years younger, just like you, the relationship is completely different. So do you think your older siblings just didn't get along with your parents? That might have been the
No,
reason.
no,
Okay.
no. I think that, no, as a family, we've all gotten along
Okay.
really, really well. Yeah, I would say very close. And I think every one of my siblings were very close with my parents. Um, Dad was, yeah, my parents were, uh, very godly people. Maybe they would say something different, but I never felt like they were favoring one of us over the
Okay.
other. But unless everybody thinks I'm the favored one, I have no idea.
They've been lying to you for all this time.
Yeah, which is very possible. I don't know. I
Yeah,
don't think
they
so.
all got together and said, "Hey, never tell Ted."
Yes, exactly. Just go back a little bit. My second oldest brother, um, 15 years older than me, is my godparent. He's my godfather. And so
I think you're secretly
he
Amish.
actually, yeah, it could be. Uh, I don't know. I like zippers better than
There you
hoods, so I
go.
don't know. But anyway, maybe that's more Mennonite. Anyway, so my brother Dennis was an air traffic controller, and as when I started to expand and get bigger, he started to show up, and you can give me like a week in the fall and a week in the spring, and he'd jump on the corn planter and plant for me, and then would come back and start running grain cart. And to be honest with you, then when he retired and we had him full time as grain cart operator, I seriously, seriously, seriously mean this. I think he was probably the best grain cart operator in the country in his prime. One day I had a friend riding with me. I have to tell this story because I think it's so wonderful. I didn't know for sure. I had a friend with me in the combine. He says, "Hey, Denny's pretty good at what he does, isn't he?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, I said, so I got on the CB and I said, "Hey, Denny, how many pounds am I getting per round?" Oh, he says you're getting about 11,000. Well, the guy riding with me and I watched the monitor and we made one run. We had 11,000 pounds and we were doing beans in a short field or something and goes, oh my gosh, that's amazing. Well, yeah, he was that type of operator, knew where he needed to be and when he needed to be there. I lost you, Jim. I don't know if you can hear me.
I have to unmute.
Oh. Oh. Well, that's good.
Oh yeah, yeah. If you're talking to Florian, one of these things, hey, I was on his podcast and this idiot that did unmute himself. Well, back to what you were talking about with your brother running a grain cart. There's a skill and knowing where to be, whether you're running a grain cart or tendering for a sprayer. Learning that skill, I think that also goes back to learning where you fit into an operation. And you talk about Scott and Caleb on one knows how to do mechanics, one's really good at marketing. You ran the combine, your brother ran the grain cart. You figured it out. And what advice would you give to a farm, regardless of a starting one or one that's in transition, to figuring out where you all fit?
Yeah, I don't know. Well, maybe in my case, I choose which ones I want
There
to
you
do.
go.
I want to plant corn and drive the combine. Actually, to tell you the truth, the combine one's probably the easiest one because I do not want to get in and out of a truck all day long, and I think the boys realize that. And they feel I might be able to do the least amount of damage sitting in the combine. That's a tough one because I don't know how we came upon it so naturally, but for us, I think it naturally fit. And I don't know if, you know, as far as like Caleb with the finances and the marketing, I mean, that I was probably better there than by far than agronomy. I wasn't terrible in the shop working on things. I'm not anywhere close to the skills that Scott has in that area, but I wasn't horrible. So I don't know if Caleb it became a desire of his because it was a desire of mine on the marketing side and the finance side. But yeah, I don't know that we ever set out to. There was ever a design plan to figure that out.
Okay.
I think it just evolved. And I wish I had more of a plan for it. Maybe to help the next. I think you see where it fits. And one thing I want to do, I've probably got. I told the boys I wanted to work till I was 69 or 70, so I got about 5-6 years left. I do want to transition in the next couple of years out of the corn planter. I think I'd like to end up going to the tillage side. Right now, Caleb runs the soybean planter, and we've got a tremendously young hired man that we are contemplating bringing into the business with us. I think he'd like to get involved, and we're looking at how to get him some skin in the game. But I think the natural progression would be Caleb moved to the corn planter, Kyle moved to the bean planter, I'll jump into the tillage, and Scott's a phenomenal sprayer guy, and unfortunately I think he's probably going to have to stay in the sprayer. So.
Well, if you put that high speed on, your old feeble brain, Ted, might not be able to handle that speed in the corn planter.
I know. I didn't want to add it to do. I'm not adding it to go 10 miles an hour, but I'm a guy that likes to keep it at 5.5, and I just think if I could go 7.5, I mean that's 50% more. Isn't
that amazing, those discussions that we're having? Who would have thought that you would consider when you started planting in 1983 that if I went 50% faster, I'd be 50% faster done? We never thought that.
I know. And the thing is the high-speed planters that I'm watching around our area, the seed placement is phenomenal. And that's another reason I want to do it. It's better than I can do at 5.5.
Wow.
And it's insane. It's insane.
it to- yeah, it's insane. It's just I think about Jessica Lange bringing out that lunch to her husband that's shelling corn and in that K2 with the 2-row head, and now you're talking about high speed planners, and yeah, that's only 40 years.
Yeah, I know. I thought my dad saw a lot in his change in his farming career, and I'm convinced I've seen as much, and I think it's escalating faster.
Mm-hmm.
And what's AI going to do? And I don't have a clue how, but I mean, I think we're going to see a revolution that way too.
Yeah, AI is a
Um,
podcast series of its own.
yes, and so we can end that part of this podcast right there on the AI because I told you everything I know.
Yeah, AI. That was what they're starting when you had sows, right? So you didn't have to have a
Yes,
bore
yes,
around.
that's right. That's right. And I did some of that. I did some of that.
So you did see some technology on the livestock side. That's cool.
I did. Yep.
Well, Ted, I think you've given us some invaluable insight into some transition plans. We've hit on fair and equitable. We've hit on equal. We've hit on being open and looking for that catalyst, in your case, Scott, that helped you guys put on paper what you thought. So I think those are some great lessons that can be shared with anybody that's transitioning, regardless of a farm or non-farm entity. So we've hit the part of our podcast where I ask our guests the same 5 questions. And we've probably covered some of them already, but they're the same questions we asked. So here we go. Ted, what is one lesson that ag has taught you that you carry with you every day?
Um, that I want to work hard so that when my head hits the pillow at night, um, there's a good, deep, restful sleep. Sometimes it's not always that way, but I want to sleep deeply, knowing I've worked hard, and sometimes it's frustrating, and sometimes you don't sleep, but most of the time, um, I don't know what it is about growing things, but I can't make it grow. That's God. I know that, but I can water it and I can nourish it and I can, I can't make it grow, but I know that I've done all I can uh, to get it to grow.
Okay.
And so when I just want a deep sleep because I worked hard.
As you look back on over 40 years of growing your own crops, how do you have that contentment when your head hits the pillow when your day was, by all counts, a failure? Something broke, you didn't get something done.
I in or there's more to my story, Jim, and I know you know part
Mm-hmm.
of it's too, and I made some tremendous financial horrible marketing decisions, being greedy and things like that. But yeah, those don't go well. Those don't go well. But I just think at the end of the day, I guess in my own heart, I know there's nothing I'm intentionally trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, I integrity is a huge part of who I think I am. I want to I want to have integrity, and I think no matter how bad the day is or how bad things went, I think the integrity at the end of the day helps me sleep,
Very good.
whether it's good or bad.
I
Yeah.
think that's a good lesson. So, our next question, if you could spend one afternoon with any agricultural figure from history, who would it be?
Ooh. Huh. Wow, that's a good one. I don't know. I'd probably, this sounds weird, but it'd probably be somebody in marketing, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure who because there's a lot of good ones. Uh, but from a marketing standpoint, if it could help me learn how to market better, never met the guy. I've been trying to meet him. I've been trying to go out for coffee on the beach with him every time I'm down in Naples, Florida, and he always is in Utah, but MSG Capital.
Mm-hmm.
But from an agricultural standpoint, I guess if you really wanted to dig deep and go back and try to get inside their head and figure out what was going on there.
Mm-hmm.
Probably George Washington Carver.
Okay.
I mean, what he did with the peanuts and how many different uses for peanuts and everything like that. How'd you figure that out?
That's a great one. And can you share why you know about George Washington Carver and the typical person
Well,
doesn't?
first of all, his story is amazing from the standpoint of when they were trying to free the slaves. And I don't remember exactly the entire story, but the slave owner went to retrieve his mother because they had stolen her to try to free her or something. And he walked up there and was trying to retrieve his mother. And the guys who had captured her basically handed him a baby, and he handed him a horse, and he walked back, and that baby ended up being George Washington Carver. And he's got Iowa ties, Iowa State, and just the impact he's had on the peanut. And I don't know enough of his story to be intelligent about adding any more to it than that, but I just know that he, to be a black man and do what he did for agriculture is truly amazing because there isn't a lot on that side to do what he did.
Well, if you separate his slave legacy with the challenges of Jim Crow and just look at when he lived and what we were doing in research in agriculture, that was really, I mean, that was the Industrial Revolution. We were
Yeah,
doing things in a lab that are mundane today, but we discovered it then.
yeah,
And then you add the layers of a former slave, Jim Crow, living in Iowa where he was one of the only black people on campus and probably one of the only faculty members. But he had a heck of a story.
yeah,
I did not
yeah. He
expect
did,
that
and
from you,
then
Ted.
and then then you go up from and then there's a tie between George Washington Carver and Henry Wallace, and then Henry Wallace to Garst, and it's I heard actually, Jim, I heard this all in a sermon recently. A guy laid out like what it was basically talking about your who should you be thankful for, and all four of those guys tied together, and it went back to, well, how much respect do you have for George Washington Carver's adopted father for going up and rescuing him and then adopting him. And
Mm-hmm.
it's just like, and then you get up to Rosalind Garst and Henry Wallace and those guys, being credited with the saving billions of lives for their hybrid corn crosses,
Mm-hmm.
you know, credited with that. So who are you going to give the credit to?
Well, you
You
would.
just keep backing up and
Oh
backing
yeah,
up and backing up.
that George R.
So
Carver has a neat story, and we wouldn't have peanut butter without George Washington Carver.
that's right. And I eat a lot of that.
What is one obscure or quirky thing about ag you think more people should know?
Quirky. I think the quirkiness is everybody. I, I would say that, it's always thought that the farmer doesn't get to set his own price. And while that's true, I would say that really no other business gets to either because it's all driven by the market.
Mm-hmm.
If another business, if they're making, I don't care if they're making wooden spools to put thread on, they don't get to dictate their price. If they can't compete, they have to lower their price or they have to cut costs. They have to figure it out just like we do. I think that's one thing, the myth, I guess I would say about agriculture is, we ask what it costs to buy something and then we ask how much will you give me when we sell it. But I think that rings true for every business.
Well, and I think we also forget that we're in a commodity business.
Yep.
We're not making finished cars. We're not making the pork. We're not
Right.
making the cooked pork chop. We're in a commodity business, and it's
Yep.
real easy for us to blame Chicago for a lot of ills.
Yep.
Yeah.
And we do.
Yes. I think we both resemble that. Uh, what is your favorite agricultural tool, product, or innovation?
Boy, I don't know. To be honest with you, I still have to say the combine because to me, I'm amazed at how you can take a 40-foot bean head, cutting 5 miles an hour sometimes when it's dry, and how you can shove that much material through that fast and have it separate and be as clean as it is. And I, and yet, if you look at the inside of a case combine with a rotor, there's nothing to it.
Yeah.
It's pretty simple,
It's a bunch of
but it's
cylinders and bars.
incredible. I
Yeah.
know. I'm awed. I'm awed and I'm awed all day long while I'm driving through there, and you watch, 12 rows of corn come flying in and 250 bushel corn, and it's flabbergasting.
Well, and think about the people that first made that. Was it Cyrus McCormick and Massey Harris and
Yep.
those people that made those first combines? They did it without the help of a computer and probably a slide rule too.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, the combine, it's just amazing. And I still call the body a thrasher. And I got that from a man down by Perry, Scott Seeley. When I helped him, he talked about, well, I'm going to trade thrashers. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Well, it's a combine. Oh, the combine part, thrasher part, thrasher part. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And I get some funny looks, and I call the thrasher like, what are you talking about? Well, the combine. That's a good one. So the last question, what is one small act or change you think could make the biggest difference in agriculture's future?
I thought I had something. In a good way or in a bad way?
I think it's meant to be in a good way, but
Good way. Yes. Yes. I don't know. I would say, and I think I'm part of it right now. Farmers, for the most part, are pretty good about getting together and talking. I think as a whole, I think as we get bigger and bigger, we get less and less trusting of our next door neighbor. But I think, and I don't want to use the formal term peer groups, but I think all the podcasting that's going on and all the free share of ideas that goes on has helped and will continue to help. And I just feel like if we, like today, Jim, I told you I would love to get up in front of a bunch of people, and this is one way of doing it on the podcast, and tell these guys to transition and how much fun and it doesn't have to look like mine. It doesn't have to. Everybody's story can be different in how you do it and everything you do along the way. But I think the free flow of ideas, it wouldn't be a new innovation, but maybe we need to be willing to help each other. So I hate to say the family farm, but so that you as a family can still farm.
Mm-hmm.
How's that sound? Or your individuals.
Would you sum it up as just be willing to be open with fellow farmers?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think so. And yet, and to be honest, it's always easier to trust when you're further from home than when you're at home.
Yeah.
We've got a couple of operations around here that I don't want to say boo to, not because I'm unfriendly, but I'm not going to share any of my secrets with them.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, on the other hand, there's a couple other operations in this area that I think we could work really, really well with. And I kind of see that as my role right now with one place I could be a little bit more strategic for Scott and Caleb is I could be the one to go out and have a conversation with some of these guys and say, is there something we could be doing together better than we're doing apart?
Well, here's the funny thing, Ted. I'm between 500 and 600 acres, and I have the exact
Yep.
same thoughts that you do.
Yeah.
So I'm not gonna go
Yeah.
talk to this person. I'm not gonna go talk to the person. Man, could we do something? Yeah, and so I think that's just an ag.
Yeah.
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 Well, Ted, thank you so much for your time and insights. I count you as one of my great friends, and I think you and I are a testament to what good came out of the heyday of ag Twitter. Because I wouldn't have met you without ag Twitter.
No, you're right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, and I just keep thinking that one of these days the Mexican restaurant in Traer is calling our name.
There you go.
We got to go back.
Yes, we do. So, well, I think that, Ted, you've given us some nuggets to think about on transitions, the importance of talking about the transition, reaching out to those people that might be the catalyst, and how you balance the tradition and innovation. You're talking about starting with a Ford TW20 and going to a high-speed planter. It shows just how much farming has changed in your years. And I will get the information for the people that you used, and we'll put those in the podcast notes. So I really appreciate your time, Ted, and I look forward to the next time that we can get together face-to-face in Northeast Iowa.
That sounds great, Jim. Thank you so much. I enjoyed it immensely.
And to my podcast followers, this is just one more of our discussions where we got into the deeper roots of what make people ag today. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Patio Pondering. We hope you enjoyed exploring both the expected and obscure corners of agriculture with us. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your favorite platform. We'd love to hear your thoughts and suggestions. Connect with us anytime at jim@patiopondering.com. Until next time, keep growing, exploring, and cultivating.